August 27th, 2017. The Playboy Mansion, 10,236 Charing Cross Road, Los Angeles. A 91-year-old man takes his last breath in a bedroom that has been converted into a hospital suite. Oxygen tanks, medical monitors, rotating shifts of nurses. This is how the king of the sexual revolution died. Isolated, confused, unable to recognize the parade of blonde girlfriends who claimed to love him until the very end. Hugh Hefner built an empire selling the fantasy of eternal pleasure, silk pajamas, beautiful women, champagne that never stopped flowing. But what they don't show you in the magazine spreads is what happens when the party finally ends, when your body fails, when the women are paid to stay, when the mansion becomes a gilded cage you can never leave. This is the story of Hugh Hefner's final years. Not the myth, not the brand. The reality of what happened when America's most famous hedonist became a prisoner of his own creation. It's darker than you think. And more tragic than anyone wanted to admit. To understand how Hefner ended up dying alone in a mansion filled with people, you have to understand the scale of what he created. Hugh Marston Hefner didn't just publish pornography. He built an entire cosmology with himself as the sun and everything else in orbit around him. By 1972, Playboy Enterprises was worth approximately $200 million, roughly $1.4 billion in today's money. The magazine had a monthly circulation of 7 million copies. To put that in perspective, that's larger than the New Yorker, GQ, and Esquire combined, and then doubled. But the magazine was just the beginning. Hefner created Playboy clubs, nightclubs where waitresses dressed as bunnies served wealthy men. At the empire's peak in the 1970s, there were over 30 clubs worldwide generating millions in annual revenue. There was Playboy Records, Playboy Productions, Playboy Hotels. The Playboy Bunny logo became one of the most recognized symbols in the world, worth hundreds of millions in licensing alone. Then there was the Jet, the Big Bunny, a customized DC-9 with a living room, a disco floor, and a bedroom with an elliptical bed covered in Tasmanian opossum fur. It cost $5.5 million in 1969 dollars, about $44 million today. The Jet's tail number was N950PB. Hefner used it to fly to Playboy clubs, to transport celebrities, to project power. And at the center of it all, the Playboy Mansion. First, the Chicago Mansion, purchased in 1959 for $400,000. Then the Los Angeles Mansion in 1971 for $1.1 million, about $8.3 million today. The LA Mansion became the ultimate symbol of Hefner's philosophy made concrete. 29 rooms, a zoo, a grotto with a heated swimming pool, a game house, a pipe organ, a screening room that sat 50 people. But here's what matters. Hefner wasn't just selling sex. He was selling a philosophy. The Playboy philosophy ran as a 25-part series in the magazine from 1962 to 1965, where Hefner articulated his vision of American masculinity, sexual liberation, and individual freedom. He genuinely believed he was a revolutionary, a champion of free speech, a warrior against American Puritanism, and in some ways, he was. The Playboy Foundation funded civil rights causes. Hefner published interviews with Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and James Baldwin. In 1955, when most of white America was deeply segregated, Playboy featured black jazz musicians and refused to franchise clubs in cities that wouldn't allow integrated audiences. The man saw himself as a visionary, not a pornographer. A philosopher king in silk pajamas who happened to make his fortune from naked women. Understanding this ego, This self-mythology is critical to understanding what came later. From 1974 to 1989, 15 years, Hugh Hefner rarely left the Playboy mansion. And not just rarely travelled, he rarely left his bedroom. This wasn't reclusiveness born of depression or social anxiety. This was the logical endpoint of Hefner's philosophy, creating a world so perfect, so tailored to your desires, that there's no reason to ever leave it. The mansion had everything. A zoo with flamingos, peacocks, monkeys. The grotto, a stone cave surrounding a heated pool, connected to the main pool by an underwater tunnel. A game house with pinball machines and arcade games. The screening room where Hefner watched 150-plus films per year, keeping meticulous logs. Former girlfriends and staff members have described the routine in memoirs and interviews. Hefner would wake around 10 a.m. Same breakfast every day. Cereal and grapefruit juice. He'd work on the magazine from bed. Editors came to him, bringing layouts, article drafts, photo selections. Hefner made every significant decision about Playboy from that bed. Afternoons were for classic films. Hefner was obsessed with Hollywood's golden age. Casablanca, Citizen Kane, the films of Howard Hawks and Billy Wilder. He'd watch them over and over, alone, or with whatever girlfriend was on rotation. Dinner was at 5:30 p.m. sharp. Family dinner, with the girlfriends who lived in the mansion at any given time. The menu rarely changed. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, a specific way. One girlfriend remembers being scolded for arriving at 5:33. Evenings were either parties, the legendary Playboy mansion parties where celebrities, politicians, and wannabes mingled by the grotto, or more films. Then came the nighttime routine. This is where it gets dark. Hefner had a rotating schedule of girlfriends, not just women who dated him. Women who lived in the mansion, received allowances, and had specific nights assigned to them for sex. One former girlfriend described receiving $1,000 per week in cash, walking money, in exchange for being available when it was her designated night. The same routine. Every day, for 15 years. No spontaneity, no surprises. A hermetically sealed world where everything and everyone existed to serve Hugh Hefner's comfort and pleasure. By the late 1980s, people who visited the mansion noticed something. Hefner seemed frozen in time, still wearing the same silk pajamas, still hosting the same kind of parties, still dating the same type of blonde women, just younger versions. The world outside was changing. AIDS crisis, feminist backlash against objectification, shifting sexual politics. But inside the mansion, it was always 1975. Then came the 1990s, and reality crashed through the gates. Playboy was hemorrhaging money. Magazine circulation had dropped from 7 million in 1972 to under 3.5 million by 1995. The Playboy clubs were closing one by one, no longer profitable, increasingly seen as dated relics of pre-feminist America. The last club closed in 1988. Hefner's children, Christy Hefner had taken over as CEO in 1988, were trying to save the company. But the old man, still in his mansion, still in his pajamas, resisted every change. He didn't understand why the formula that worked for 40 years wasn't working anymore. The internet was beginning to emerge. Free pornography, more explicit than anything Playboy had ever published, was suddenly available to anyone with a modem. Why pay $6 for a magazine when you could see everything online for free? By 2009, Playboy Enterprises stock had fallen to under $3 per share, down from highs of over $30 in the 1980s. The company was worth less than $200 million, a fraction of its peak value. In 2011, Hefner engineered a deal to take the company private again, buying out public shareholders for $6.15 per share with backing from a private equity firm. But here's what's important. Hefner no longer controlled the empire he'd built. He was essentially a figurehead, a brand ambassador. In 2016, the ultimate humiliation. Playboy Enterprises sold the Playboy mansion for $100 million to Darren Metropolis, a billionaire who'd made his fortune from Hostess snack cakes. The condition of sale? Hefner could live there until his death, paying rent of $1 million per year. The king was now a tenant in his own castle. This is where the story gets truly uncomfortable. In 2000, at age 74, Hugh Hefner began dating multiple women simultaneously again after a brief marriage to Kimberly Conrad had ended. These weren't casual relationships. These were live-in girlfriends who appeared with him publicly, filmed a reality show called The Girls Next Door, and created the illusion of a harem of women who genuinely loved this elderly man. The main girlfriends during the 2000s were Holly Madison, Bridget Marquardt, and Kendra Wilkinson. They moved into the mansion, received allowances, and performed the role of devoted girlfriends on camera. The reality show ran from 2005 to 2010 on E! And was massively successful, introducing Hefner to a new generation. But after the cameras stopped rolling, the truth emerged in memoirs and interviews. Holly Madison, in her 2015 memoir Down the Rabbit Hole, described the reality of life in the mansion. The 9 p.m. curfew for all girlfriends. The lack of freedom to have outside friends or jobs. The allowance system, $1,000 per week in cash, given every Friday, that could be revoked if you displeased Hefner. The mandatory schedule of sexual encounters. Madison described feeling trapped, isolated. She wrote about contemplating suicide in the bedroom of the Playboy mansion, feeling like a prisoner in what the world saw as paradise. After the original girlfriends left, Hefner, now in his mid-80s, found new ones. Crystal Harris, a then 24-year-old model, became his primary girlfriend in 2009. In 2011, they planned to marry. The wedding was scheduled for June 18, 2011. 5 days before the ceremony, Harris called it off and fled the mansion. The humiliation was public and total. Hefner was 85 years old, jilted by a woman young enough to be his great-granddaughter. But here's what happened next. Crystal came back. On December 31st, 2012, she married Hefner in an intimate ceremony at the mansion. She was 26. He was 86. Why did she come back? The generous interpretation is love. The cynical interpretation involves money, the promise of inheritance, and the Playboy brand. Crystal has never given a fully convincing explanation. What's undeniable is that from 2012 until Hefner's death in 2017, Crystal Harris was his primary caretaker and companion as his health deteriorated. By 2015, Hugh Hefner was 89 years old and failing rapidly. According to people who visited the mansion in those final years, Hefner rarely left his bed anymore. Not by choice this time. His body was giving out. He had hearing problems severe enough that he needed hearing aids. His vision was deteriorating. He walked with difficulty, requiring assistance. The silk pajamas that had been a trademark, a symbol of leisure and sexuality, now looked different on a frail, elderly man who needed help standing up. The parties continued, but Hefner often wasn't there. Or he'd appear briefly, shuffling through with Crystal on his arm, staying for 20 minutes before retreating to his bedroom. The mansion had become a brand that functioned without him. Former guests from those final years describe a strange, sad atmosphere. The mansion itself was deteriorating, paint peeling, carpets stained, the zoo animals gone, the grotto's pool filtration system barely functioning. The whole place felt frozen in 1975, but crumbling around the edges. And Hefner's bedroom, once the command center of his empire, had been converted into something closer to a hospital room. Medical equipment, nurses on rotation, medications organized in daily pillboxes. In 2015, Hefner suffered a urinary tract infection that developed into sepsis, a life-threatening condition where infection spreads through the bloodstream. He was hospitalized briefly, then returned to the mansion to recover. After that, the medical presence intensified. By 2016, Hefner rarely engaged with visitors. Friends who saw him described cognitive decline. He'd repeat himself, forget conversations from earlier in the day, ask the same questions multiple times. One particularly heartbreaking detail from a visitor's account. Hefner, in his final year, would sometimes forget which girlfriend he was with. He'd call Crystal by the names of previous girlfriends, Holly, Kendra, Bridget, women who'd left years earlier. The man who'd spent decades curating every detail of his public image was losing control of his own mind. In early 2017, it became clear to everyone close to Hefner that he was dying. He'd lost significant weight. His already thin frame became skeletal. He needed help with basic activities, getting out of bed, bathing, eating. The nurses who'd been part-time became full-time, 24-hour care. Crystal Harris remained by his side throughout this period, along with Hefner's children from previous marriages, Christy, David, Marston, and Cooper. There was a reconciliation of sorts, the family gathering around the patriarch as he declined. But here's what's important. Hefner never left the mansion. Even as his health failed, even as doctors recommended hospital care for better treatment, he refused to go. The mansion, his creation, his prison, his entire world for over 40 years, was where he would die. According to accounts from people who visited in those final months, Hefner spent most of his time sleeping. When awake, he watched old films. The same classics he'd watched thousands of times. Casablanca, Citizen Kane, the films of his youth. He rarely spoke. When he did, it was often confused. He'd ask about the magazine, not understanding that he hadn't made editorial decisions in years. He'd ask about girlfriends from decades past. One visitor described arriving to find Hefner in bed, the curtains drawn, old Hollywood movies playing on a screen, and Hefner barely conscious, occasionally stirring to mumble something incomprehensible before drifting off again. This was the final reality of Hugh Hefner's philosophy of pleasure. A 91-year-old man, semi-conscious, surrounded by medical equipment in a decaying mansion, while paid companions and family members kept vigil. Hugh Hefner died of cardiac arrest and respiratory failure on August 27, 2017, at 9 p.m. He was in his bed in the Playboy mansion. Crystal Harris was there. His children were there. The nurses were there, monitoring his vital signs until they stopped. The death certificate listed the immediate cause as cardiac arrest. Contributing factors: septicemia, blood infection, and E. coli infection. His body, weakened by age and illness, simply shut down. When the announcement came the next morning, the media response was predictable. Obituaries celebrated him as a revolutionary, a champion of sexual freedom, the man who changed America's sexual attitudes. Celebrities posted tributes. The Playboy brand issued statements honoring their founder. But beneath the official narrative a darker truth emerged in the accounts of people who'd been there. Hefner died, as he'd lived the last 40-plus years, inside the Playboy mansion, never having truly left, surrounded by people whose relationship to him was transactional. The girlfriends who were paid, the staff who were employed, even his children, who'd been estranged for years before reconciling at the end. The man who'd built an empire on the fantasy of endless pleasure, of eternal youth, of life as a permanent party, died in exactly the opposite reality. Old, sick, confused, trapped in a crumbling mansion that had become his tomb long before his actual death. Within days of Hefner's death, the myth-making began. Playboy Enterprises released carefully curated statements about his legacy. Friends and celebrities shared their favorite Hefner stories, the parties, the philosophy, the cultural impact. The media ran retrospectives about how Playboy changed American sexuality. But parallel to the official narrative, another story emerged, from the women who'd lived it. Holly Madison, in interviews following Hefner's death, was blunt about her experience. She described the mansion not as a paradise, but as a cult-like environment. Psychological control through financial dependence, isolation from outside relationships, a daily routine designed to keep the girlfriends compliant and available. She described Hefner not as the charming rogue of public imagination, but as a controlling patriarch who used money and access to manipulate young women into accepting a lifestyle most would find degrading. Other former girlfriends shared similar accounts. The mandatory photo nights, where girlfriends were required to pose for Polaroids in Hefner's bedroom. The rigid schedule of sexual encounters. The way Hefner would pit girlfriends against each other, threatening to replace them if they complained. Crystal Harris, who inherited a portion of Hefner's estate. Reports vary, but estimates suggest around $5 million, plus the right to live in another Playboy property, remained largely silent about the reality of those final years. She issued standard statements about missing him, about their love, about his legacy. But people who knew the situation described it differently. A young woman who'd signed on for a glamorous lifestyle and ended up as a glorified nurse to a dying elderly man, unable to leave because of financial entanglement and public scrutiny. Hefner's children inherited the majority of his personal estate, estimated at around $35 million, far less than the billions the empire was worth at its peak. Most of the wealth had been dissipated or existed in trust structures and corporate holdings. The Playboy mansion itself was already sold. Darren Metropolis, the new owner, announced plans to renovate it extensively, potentially connecting it to the property next door that he also owned. In 2018, renovation began. Workers found the mansion in far worse condition than expected. Rotted infrastructure, outdated electrical systems, mold, damage from decades of neglect. The estimated renovation cost, over $10 million. The symbol of American hedonism was literally rotting from the inside. So, what is Hugh Hefner's actual legacy beyond the mythology? He did change American culture. Playboy was genuinely influential in the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s. The magazine published serious journalism and fiction alongside the nude photographs. The Playboy clubs, for all their problematic elements, provided opportunities for women to earn good money at a time when options were limited. Hefner's advocacy for civil rights, gay rights, and free speech was real. He put his money behind causes that were genuinely progressive for their time. But the cost of that legacy was borne by the women who lived it, the girlfriends who described psychological damage that took years of therapy to process, the Playboy bunnies who dealt with sexual harassment and assault that was considered just part of the job. the cultural normalization of treating women as decorative objects that Playboy pioneered and that persists today. And the personal cost to Hefner himself, a man who built a perfect world and then became its prisoner, who never developed the ability to function outside his curated environment, who died having not walked outside his mansion's gates in years, having not had a spontaneous interaction in decades. What strikes me about Hefner's final years is how thoroughly they revealed the bankruptcy of his philosophy. The idea that pleasure can be engineered, that sexuality can be controlled and scheduled, that surrounding yourself with paid companions constitutes intimacy. All of it fell apart when his body failed and his mind deteriorated. In the end, he was just an old man dying in a big house, no different from any other elderly person, except that his cage was more expensive. Hugh Hefner spent the last 40-plus years of his life inside the Playboy mansion, by choice. He created a perfect world tailored to his every desire. And then he could never leave it. That's the real tragedy. Not that he died. Not even that he died alone. Technically, he didn't. Though one could argue about the quality of the companionship surrounding him. The tragedy is that he became a prisoner of his own creation decades before his death. The silk pajamas that represented leisure became a uniform he couldn't remove. The mansion that symbolized freedom became a cage. The endless parade of young girlfriends became a desperate attempt to deny the reality of aging and mortality. The philosophy of pleasure became a trap. I think what Hefner's story shows us, what those final, sad years in the mansion reveal, is that you cannot engineer happiness. You cannot buy intimacy. You cannot construct a perfect world and hide inside it forever. Reality eventually intrudes. Bodies fail. Minds deteriorate. And if you've spent your entire adult life avoiding authentic human connection in favor of transactional relationships, you will die surrounded by people, but fundamentally alone. Hugh Hefner wanted to be remembered as a revolutionary, a champion of freedom, a philosopher king who changed American culture. But the image that sticks with me is different. A confused 91-year-old man, skeletal and weak, unable to recognize the people around him, dying in a bed in a crumbling mansion he hadn't left in decades, while nurses monitored machines and a wife young enough to be his great-granddaughter kept vigil for reasons that had very little to do with love. That's not revolution. That's just sad. Hugh Marston Hefner died on August 27, 2017. He was buried in Westwood Memorial Park in Los Angeles, in a crypt he'd purchased in 1992 next to Marilyn Monroe. One final, desperate attempt to link himself to the glamour and sexuality he'd spent his life chasing. The Playboy empire continues without him, a brand more than a philosophy. The mansion was renovated and is now a private residence, all traces of Hefner's presence erased. And the women who lived through those years, the girlfriends, the bunnies, the companions, are still processing the trauma, still trying to reconcile the public narrative of glamour with the private reality of control and exploitation. If this story teaches us anything, it's that the pursuit of endless pleasure leads nowhere but to a gilded cage. That surrounding yourself with paid companions is not the same as love. That building a perfect world and never leaving it is not freedom. It's the slowest form of suicide. Hugh Hefner died the way he lived, isolated in luxury, surrounded by beauty he'd purchased, in a world entirely of his own making. He just didn't realize his perfect world was also his prison until it was far too late to escape. If this story affected you, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss more fascinating and tragic stories from history.